All right, hello and welcome to SacTown Talks. Today we're addressing an important topic for today, talking a little bit about the digital divide and internet for all. And joining us today is Mark Guillen with Crown Castle, going to help us kind of get through this issue and talk about how Crown Castle can help. Mark, welcome to the program. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jarrett. I really appreciate you inviting me today to be on SacTown Talks.
Hey, our pleasure. It's been a topic of a lot of members have brought up lately. Given how we're all in shelter in place or working from home, doing school from home, and a big problem is that we are in 2020, but a lot of people don't have internet. Can you kind of, I guess, tell us a little bit about your company and kind of what they're doing to help solve this problem of about the digital divide?
Of course. So thanks for asking. As many people may not know, Crown Castle is the largest provider of shared telecommunication infrastructure in the nation. And what that means is that we own and operate and lease over 40,000 cell towers and approximately 80,000 route miles of fiber. And so those support our small cell and fiber solutions across every major market. And so that whole complete portfolio together of communication infrastructure, it's what actually connects our cities and our communities to the data and the technology and of course the wireless service that they use every day to perform business and to connect people to people every day.
Interesting. So I guess what is your specific role within Crown Castle, Mark?
So I am Crown Castle's public affairs manager, and I am managing public affairs throughout the Western region for Crown Castle.
Okay. And I guess how does Crown Castle interact with internet service providers or telecommunication companies?
Yeah, so we are not a service provider in any way. We solely focus on the infrastructure, and so we build that infrastructure out, and many of the users of our infrastructure, the carriers, they lease that space off from us, and oftentimes that's shared on our assets. So what that does is that not only allows us to put multiple carriers in one particular area and lower the blight that might be in the right of way, but it also reduces the cost of the carriers in order to operate.
Yeah, we've had a lot of members, as I alluded to earlier, kind of come on and talk about, the lack of broadband in their area, the digital divide. Can you kind of explain to our listeners, what the digital divide is?
Sure. Well, let's agree on something. Let's agree that we now live in a world where access to the internet is no longer a luxury, but it's an absolute necessity in order to for us to operate in today's world. And unfortunately, there are many in our communities who do not have the access that they need. And so, for instance, the FCC has recently told us that there are nearly 30 million Americans who cannot reap the benefits of access to the internet for a variety of reasons, mostly because of lack of access to the high-speed internets that they need.
And so, kind of as we're getting through this, what's shocking to me is that we've heard from people in rural areas talk about lack of connectivity, which I guess could make sense. It's 2020. We'd hope everyone would have connectivity, but understand why people in the rural areas might have difficulty with. But we also hear about people in urban areas where you think there would be a lot of connectivity. Can you kind of talk to us about where these gaps of connectivity are in the state, and I guess what percentage of the state is currently covered by service providers?
Well, first of all, so I mentioned that 30 million Americans don't have the access that they need, and of those 30 million, 80% don't have that reliable high-speed access because they live in rural areas. And so oftentimes we talk about what actually drives that lack of resource for rural areas. And the reality is that up until now, economics has really driven how the infrastructure has been deployed. So oftentimes, because of the long permitting process and the long deployment time it takes to fulfill the fees associated with that, carriers who request the infrastructure, they're mostly focused on high dense areas, oftentimes in business centers or in the center of downtowns. And when it comes to deploying in maybe underserved areas or especially in rural areas, just the difficulty to deploy often prohibits them to do it in those areas. And so, like we talked about before, I think what the pandemic has done is it's really shown a light on how the lack of access to the internet has really started to create what we call that digital divide, or that geographic divide between those who can access it and continue to progress, with their careers or with their lives and even their education, to those who are living in areas that have easy access and fast, reliable internet. And so, yeah, it's continued to be a problem. It's still an issue that we try to address today, and especially now during the pandemic, as folks are trying to figure out how to work remotely or distance learn for the students who are starting back in school. This is a problem that I'm sure not only us, but many legislators are also trying to think through, how do they make sure they close that gap for their constituents?
Yeah, and I think that's a good point you bring up. And I guess people are changing how they work, how they go to school, and there's not that daily commute anymore. So now people are looking at, I guess, living other places further away from where their work would be or from cities. I guess kind of what is the cost associated with, I guess, putting this infrastructure in to, I guess, areas where there is no connectivity?
Well, like I said before, a lot of the cost is associated with the fees in deployment. That could be fees required by the municipality in order to place that infrastructure in the right of way. It also just costs a lot because the time frame for deployment is very long. For instance, for a small cell, going through the whole process, it may take up to 24 or more, 36 months in order for that to go from the application to the actual deployment and use of that asset. So just the amount of time that it takes, costs a lot of resources and time, and especially now when the demand is already here. We're trying many different things to speed up that deployment and reduce the cost. So not only that we can deploy it quicker, but also that there will be more desire from, for instance, carriers to want to deploy in multiple areas, not just in those downtowns.
One thing that I guess is a topic of conversation lately is, major school districts have announced distance learning closures, and this issue of device access and lack of internet connection are coming up. I guess, can you kind of speak upon, I guess, these issues of device access and internet, and I guess how to bridge those issues for distance learning?
Sure. Definitely those are related issues. And early on, I think that early on in the pandemic, we saw much effort and much discussion about how do we get devices into students' hands that didn't have them. And of course, that's always a good thing. We need to make sure that everyone, especially our students, have devices that they can use to continue to be educated and continue to be connected. But the reality is that there has always been a long problem of that access. And so the reality is that you can have the device, but without the access in your home, especially during a pandemic, really those devices play a very small, use to actually advance, say, a student's education. We've talked about this before the pandemic, that in many underserved communities, students who have a desire to do well in school, unfortunately, since they don't have access at home, they often use places like a Starbucks or a library, maybe even a public park where they can go and they can access that to do applications or to submit their homework, for instance. But especially now during the pandemic, when those McDonald's aren't open and Starbucks is unavailable, like they're going back to remote learning, and really the critical piece now, especially, is that they have to have that access at home, readily available whenever they need it, and sometimes even late at night. So it's becoming critically important for us to really focus on these issues now.
I remember, I guess, when I was back in college, there was a big movement in, I guess, in the Silicon Valley of having, I guess, citywide internet, citywide Wi-Fi. I guess, is there any push for that further to actually have local governments providing Wi-Fi to their citizens?
I don't really willing to speak for the municipalities on why they may want to or not want to do that. What I do know is that companies like Crown Castle, their expertise is building and maintaining and upgrading the infrastructure. We can do it quickly. We have the best technology to do it. We're equipped to address emergencies very quickly. And so, of course, we know that we do it best. Those things need to be considered when we start talking about, who maintains and operates those infrastructure. And I can imagine, even though we're not an ISP, an internet service provider, that our biggest and largest internet service providers, they know how to do it very, very well. So hopefully they will continue to do that for us as the demand grows, and we will continue to have the opportunities to expand and make our infrastructure systems robust as they can be, so that we can continue to meet that demand into the future.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you brought up about, I guess, the emergency response. Senator Dodd and Assemblywoman Aguilar Curry brought this issue up of, the fires in California, and I guess having the communications necessary to, I guess, tell people an emergency is happening. And I guess, the lack of broadband in their area is making those communications difficult. I guess, can you kind of talk to us about, what's being done to help put, better equipment up in these rural areas so this, emergency service communication can.
Well, you bring up a very good point, and I think that oftentimes, when the user, of a smartphone, when we talk about things like building a more advanced network, they think, well, I'm okay the way that I am. I can make a phone call, I can receive a text, but having access is far more than that. And you just brought it up. A big component of that is the public safety aspect of that. Not only do everyday residents of a community use that network, but the first responders use that network as well. And they use that network to be able to provide the fastest and best response that they can to any emergency or any call really that they receive. And so, these networks are incredibly important and critical for our communities to work the most efficient and the best way that they can. And so I think oftentimes people don't realize that. I often talk about, for instance, national issues like wildfires, that people don't realize that, when you're in that situation, the information that you need oftentimes is pushed out through an emergency text. And just imagine if you're in that situation and you can't receive the critical text that you may need to know when you need to evacuate or stay in place. That becomes a very, very important aspect of why the infrastructure is so important.
I was just thinking, and as we're all sitting at home, we're kind of reminiscing on days of yore, on how we'd be handling this crisis without internet, kind of without the technology we have, and we're all kind of, harkening back to the days of dial-up internet. Then cable modem, DSL came, to what we have now, talking about 4G connectivity on our phones. There's talk about 5G coming out. Can you talk to us, I guess, about what's on the frontier of this technology, and I guess how it can help solve some of these digital divide issues?
Well, obviously, I think the connectivity is probably the most important thing. But when we talk about a new technology like 5G, it's much more than connectivity. It also has to do with latency, for instance. So, oftentimes in the past, when 4G was new, I'm sure everyone was very used to, trying to do a task on their smartphone and often seeing the little dial spin, because it's just the request on your phone was a little bit greater than than what the demand could handle on a network like that. So
Right.
when we talk about future, technologies using 5G, it's exactly for that reason that we're able to do that, because latency will be so much smaller, and the speed of the network is going to be multiple times faster. People will really see that, and so because of that speed, future things that we'll utilize on that network will become incredibly important. So we talked about being able to work remotely, but it'll be things like telemedicine that has become so important now. Instead of having to leave your location, you can easily call your doctor and do a face-to-face appointment, and be able to through the internet place an order for your medications and have them delivered right to your door. I mean, these things
Right.
are rapidly changing the way that we do many of these things. And then to talk about even the future of our economy, these our network and 5G is going to be what's being leaned on for things like autonomous vehicles. It'll be as we implement AI into our manufacturing, and virtual reality into our gaming, so many other things. Like, those things won't be able to come to reality until we build out a very robust network of the infrastructure that's necessary to do these things.
Yeah, and kind of it's building up that infrastructure, and I guess getting it everywhere it needs to go. And I guess how does Crown Castle, I guess, fit into that to help California, I guess, achieve its goal of solving this digital divide?
Well, one of the things we're doing is we're trying to be very innovative, during this time. And one of the things that we have been really talking about and pushing in many of our communities is this upgraded concept of microtrenching. So, we talked earlier about our assets, our towers and our fiber and our small cell. Well, in reality, that fiber optic network that we build, that's going to be the backbone of how this whole network works. And so traditionally, we bury that fiber into the ground, and the old technology and the old way of trenching in a community down a street has been very disruptive. It's very costly, and it actually makes a long-term disruption. So the street may be down for 3 or more weeks. The traffic, the rush hour traffic that goes through is slowed down, and businesses along the corridor may be affected by that open trenching. So microtrenching is a technology that addresses all of those issues. Microtrenching is a new technology where you can drill into the ground a canal, a 2-inch canal that you can place the fiber into, and you can backfill and cover with the appropriate cover. And that whole thing takes days instead of weeks.
Wow.
Oftentimes we talk about how, when we lay fiber, you may lay a couple miles of fiber in an area, we can let the morning traffic go by and then start the process, and it'll be backfilled and covered and dry by the time rush hour begins to come back home. So
Wow.
those kinds of technologies, not only are they more cost effective and less impactful for the environment and in the community, but it also helps to rapidly deploy, the critical fiber that we're going to be needing. And so, again, now during this time when we know we have an issue of demand and we need that infrastructure as soon as possible, things like microtrenching become more and more important for us to talk about and implement in the way that we deploy those things in our cities across California.
It's kind of interesting. Kind of basically, you're kind of telling us how this is done, and it's peeling back a layer for us that something that we don't really ever think about. How do we get internet, and how does that infrastructure go? I imagine much like any kind of construction in this state, there's I guess a lot of regulatory or statutory hurdles. Kind of, I guess, what are some of the issues you guys are facing and try to implementing this new infrastructure?
Well, fortunately, and even here in California, there are places that have, worked with us to implement an ordinance that utilizes microtrenching to deploy. And there are many other states that we've been working in that have also done the same. But the reality is that there's a patchwork of regulations throughout California that are very difficult for us to navigate. And so recently, fortunately, we've been able to work with Senator Lena Gonzalez on a potential bill, SB 1206, that addresses many of these issues. We've come to, many discussions to land on something that would be appropriate statewide. Unfortunately, because of COVID, and I'm sure they've limited the number of bills that they could
Right.
bring that are, exclusively related to COVID at this time. And so, we continue to be experts who can weigh in on these matters, and hopefully that we'll be able to introduce, our bill and other bills similarly to that in the coming sessions.
Okay, interesting. I guess could you go a little more in depth into the bill, and I guess how it could, I guess, help, kind of streamline things statewide?
Well, 1206, SB 1206 is specifically drilled down to microtrenching.
Okay.
I don't want to really go too much into the particulars of that bill because it's just not appropriate for me as a public affairs manager to talk about the technicalities of
Right.
those things. But it's really about just coming to an agreement for a uniform way to deploy, and that could include the fees that are associated with that. It can associate the timelines that are appropriate, and just make it uniform throughout the state, so that wherever we deploy, we can have an expectation that's realistic on how long that would take, and what the cost could be, not only to Crown but to the municipalities or the carriers, so that the idea again is that this is something that helps the whole community, and it helps to deploy the appropriate infrastructure that will continue to support the demand in the future.
Yeah, something that legislative members have brought up is, I guess trying to, get service in rural areas, and kind of, as you mentioned earlier, it's a more of a supply and demand issue. And basically, infrastructure is going where the demand is, and where people are. And I guess, they're trying to get, coverage statewide where maybe some people aren't, and where it's maybe not cost effective to put things. I guess, are there, public-private partnerships, or do you see government stepping in to, I guess, help assist and put infrastructure in where there are underserved communities? And is there, I guess, federal or state funding to help assist put this infrastructure in?
Yeah, the reality is that looking into the future, there are so many possibilities that could be helpful for this. I think just as we come together, the hope is that the legislators and companies like ours and industry who are working in California, we can all put our heads together to figure out what is the best way not only to deploy but to fund these projects. They are very expensive, and of course everyone's watching their economics, especially now during this crisis. And so
Right.
it's going to take not just Crown, but it's going to take the cooperation of so many partners. And I think when we have that cooperation, we're going to see many beneficial things come out of that.
Interesting. Well, I know you got to go, but thank you so much for joining. I guess, is there anything else you want to cover before we go?
Well, thanks for having me on this time. It's really great. I mean, part of the job, part of the role that I have at Crown Castle is not only to to talk about the great community benefits, but also just to educate people on 5G, and what the demand looks like, and how we may close the digital divide. But I want to assure everybody that me and the rest of the company, we continue to be focused on providing the best service that we can, and creating an infrastructure that is equitable and that everyone is able to use equally, so that we all benefit together.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Mark. Very informative, and we're looking forward to the future. And when SB 1206 gets going again next year, love to have you back on and dig into the details a little more.
Great. Thanks for having me today.
Right.
Really
Thanks.
appreciate it.
Bye.
Some are called dreamers.